A special thanks to J Hurl24 over on No Sleep for letting us use his story. You should check the description for the links to his work. About 6 months after my last appointment with Carrie, I picked up an overtime shift working swing shift on one of my off days. When I got into the briefing room, I sat at the open seat next to Schmidt in the back of the room. "Hey kid," he said, "you hear the news?" "No, what news?" I asked with a grin. "I'm retiring," he said. His face wore a wide, excited smile. "Just 3 months left." "Oh," I said. The grin vanished from my face, replaced by a surprised frown. "Congrats, man. That's great." Before either of us could say anything else, Sergeant Wells walked in the room. He was a tall, lengthy native. "Good afternoon, everybody." His voice held the same unemotional tone as his facial expressions. Day shift had one fight. Both inmates are in segregation. No special watches in holding, and we are going to get some yard done. He gave everyone their assignments. "Jay, you are going to assist Will with running yard. He will be here in a couple hours." Looking around the room, he asked, "That is all. If there are no other questions, let's get to it." Everyone stood up and walked out. I was the last one out of the room when I heard Sergeant Wells, "Jay, can you bust out the interior and exterior perimeter checks?" I felt my whole body tense up when he asked, "Yes, sir," I said, a slight tone of reluctance in my voice. "Thank you," he said before walking the opposite way into his office. "You'll be all right, Jay," Schmidt said, holding the door open for me. "It's daytime." I stopped walking and looked at Schmidt. He gave me a knowing and reassuring nod. Did he know? I know I haven't talked to anyone about the incident, save for Will, Mary, and Carrie. How? I began to ask. Schmidt grabbed my shoulders and looked me in the eyes. "It's okay." There was this calmness about the look in his eyes. "You'll be okay." As he spoke, the anxiety vanished from my mind, and I started to believe the words he spoke. "Come on, let's get this day started." I shook off the feeling of dread and walked with Schmidt. "Yeah, you're right." Schmidt just chuckled to himself. "Of course I am." He gave me a pat on the back. "Look, I get Will trained you, but that was a long time ago. It's time for you to pick it up." "Hey," I half-jokingly yelled. "You know, I'm glad you're retiring," a sly smirk forming on my face. "Oh yeah?" Schmidt said, a look of intrigue washing over his face. "Why's that?" "Because once you're gone, we can stop taking turns watching you," I said. "What the fuck is that supposed to mean?" he asked, a hint of annoyance in his voice. "Well, we all have to take turns watching you," I said. "We have to make sure you don't forget where you are." I laughed. When I saw the look of anger and confusion on Schmidt's face, I laughed harder. "Hey, at least we stopped carrying spare diapers to give." "It was one fucking time, Jay," Schmidt yelled, the mix of laughter, anger, and embarrassment had us both keeled over, struggling to breathe. After a couple seconds, Schmidt shot up, a look of horror painted on his face. Uh-oh. Concern quickly replaced the laughter in my voice. What? I asked. I'll see you in a little bit, Schmidt said before running past the bathroom and into the briefing room. Sergeant Wells came out of the briefing room door as Schmidt ran in. Not again, he said, half concerned and half laughing at the situation. Jay, I thought it was your turn to bring the diapers. I could hear Schmidt's voice from in the briefing room. You guys got Wells in on it too? Sergeant Wells looked at me, a rare smile on his otherwise stoic face. Jay, once you're done with the checks, come see me. He looked down where Schmidt was standing. First, get that cleaned up. Right away, I said. He turned and walked back to his office. I looked down and saw a small puddle where Schmidt stood. Ah, Schmidt, I whispered. After cleaning up Schmidt's mess, I made my way outside to begin the first check. You'll be okay, Schmidt's voice echoed in my head. Control, starting exterior perimeter check. I radioed. Copy 1520. The voice answered back. I began walking the perimeter and all was well. It was a nice sunny day. The sounds of birds chirping and squirrels running in the trees brought an unfamiliar sense of peace to the otherwise ominous forest. Until then, I had only ever seen the evil that called the forest home. After a while, I let my guard down, taking in the sight of nature, reclaiming the forest in the daylight. Once I reached the halfway point on the backside, near where Val and I thought we saw someone, when the atmosphere changed. I looked up and saw a small, dark cloud blocking the sun. The more I looked, the more unsettled I became. Looking around, I noticed there weren't any other clouds in the sky. What the fuck? I said. Jay. A whisper echoed from the trees. Immediately, I snapped my head to the forest. I could barely see into the thick foliage. After a few moments of not seeing anything, I continued my check. The cloud covering the sun began to dissipate, slowly giving more light around me. I looked ahead and could see the parking lot. I heard a branch snap and turned around. Get it together, I whispered to myself. When I looked back around, I saw a shadow on the ground in the field that separated me from the parking lot. Even though it was, maybe, 50 feet in front of me and in broad daylight, I couldn't see anyone there. Just a shadow. Jay. The whisper from the trees echoed again, this time a little louder than before. My gaze was fixed on the shadow. It had started moving. The shadow seemed to be rising up out of the ground. I snapped out of my daze. Rule 3. Just walk away, I said to myself. Not wanting to find out what happens when you don't follow that rule, I turned around. I started walking the way I came. Just before I crossed back over the halfway point, I heard a deep male voice coming from somewhere in the forest. Jay, Will, feed. I didn't even pause to look. I just started running. When I got back to the staff entrance, I radioed back to control. Perimeter check complete. I walked inside and went straight to Sergeant Wells's office. "Everything okay?" he asked. Still catching my breath, I sat in the chair across from his desk. I nodded, and we sat in silence for a moment while I caught my breath. Sergeant Wells looked at me with concern. "Okay, I'm good," I said. "Sorry, sir." "It's okay," he said. He leaned forward and looked at me for a moment. "What did you see?" he asked. I looked at him, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Jay, my family has lived here since before this country even existed. I know the look of someone who has seen something." He paused. "Unnatural." I dropped the act and asked him, "Do you know what actually happened to me and Will that night?" Sergeant Wells leaned back and sighed. "Yes." "What is the story you got?" I asked. He reached down and grabbed a packet from a drawer. "Instead of telling you, why don't you read it?" He handed me the stack of papers. "Tell me what's missing. I know it's not the full story." I read through the pages. They detailed all the events of the night of the incident, but it stopped at us returning from the clearing. No mention of Corporal D in the reports at all. "Rule 3, I said, looking back to Sergeant Wells. "What's that?" he asked. "I ran into an instance that falls under Rule 3. That's what happened before I came in here," I explained. Sergeant Wells watched me for a moment before asking, "Anything else?" "I know someone who's been through as much as you have isn't running from a shadow." Yeah," I stammered. "I heard a voice I haven't heard before." "What do you mean, haven't heard before?" he asked. "Well, I've heard the voice of the woman in the trees, even seen her at this point," I said. "But this was different. It was this deep, male voice. With a woman's voice, I could always pinpoint the direction it came from. With this one, though," I paused. "Sir, it almost seemed like it was the forest itself speaking to me." "What did it say?" he asked. "Jay, Will, feed," I said, looking down at my hands. When I looked back at Sergeant Wells, I expected to see his face, as it always was, expressionless. Only when I looked back at the man across from me, I saw a look of shock across his face. "No," he whispered. "Are you sure?" he asked. By the tone in his voice, I could tell he was more pleading for me to change my answer, rather than asking a question. His response shook me. I had never seen him show any emotions aside from the rare smile or joke. Seeing him like this, I knew something was coming. I said. Sergeant Wells picked up the phone and called someone. "Hey, it's me," he said. "It's time." I couldn't hear the response given, but based off Sergeant Wells' body language, I could tell this wasn't a pleasant call. "Yes, I'm sure. I'll make the arrangements." He hung up the phone and looked back at me. "Jay, what do you know of the old gods?" "Not much," I said. "I was raised Christian, but I don't really subscribe to any one religion now. There's someone I want to introduce you to. They may be able to give you the answers you're looking for," he said. "I'll let you know when. In the meantime, read this." He handed me a small book. I grabbed it and looked at the cover. The various gods of the forest and what to do if one calls on you. Thanks, I said. I got up and walked to the door. Hey, Jay, Sergeant Wells said. Don't let your guard down. That's when you're vulnerable. Understood, I said before walking through the door. I took a moment to collect myself before continuing on with the interior check. Bitch, Will's unmistakable voice said from behind me. Bitch, I replied. This had become our unofficial greeting some time ago. Neither of us know why or who started it. Thought you weren't coming in for a couple more hours, I said. Yeah, but I had nothing else going on, and they said I could show up early if I wanted, he said. What's left to do? Just have to do the interior check. Then we can start running yard, I said. You already did the exterior check? Will asked. I looked down at the ground. Yeah, I just got back about 15 minutes ago, I said, my voice softly trailing off. He raised one eyebrow in curiosity. How was it? He asked. It was fine. I coughed in an attempt at feigning confidence and hiding my nervousness. Will being Will saw right through it. What did you see? He asked, a playfully annoyed tone in his voice. I looked up at him, those piercing green eyes giving me a knowing look, followed Rule 3 and backtracked. His face changed from annoyed curiosity to concern. Was it in the field? Will asked, sounding like he really hoped he was wrong. I shot Will a confused look. How? That's where I saw it for the first time, too, he said. Everyone's first sight of it seems to be from that field. Wonder why? I said. I haven't gotten an answer, but I also don't really want to know. He said. Anything else? Not really, I said. Don't bullshit me, Jay, Will said. We've been friends too long for you to lie about that. At least make up something good. He laughed and slapped me on the back. Seriously, though, what else happened? I adjusted my vest and sighed. It was another voice. We began walking, a male's voice this time. Something just felt. I paused, trying to find the right word. Malevolent. I've only ever heard the woman's voice, Will said. We walked through the door and into the yard. Nice day out, he said, looking at the sky. It said, Jay, Will, feed. Same cadence as the woman, too, I explained. You don't think it could be related to the other incidents, do you? He asked. I can't think of what else it could be, I said. What's weird about it is that when I try and remember what he said, I swear I can hear the woman's threats from my first shift. Will and I completed the interior check. Let's put a pin in it for now. He notified Control that the interior check was complete and recreation was beginning. Let's start with H-Pod, Will said, opening the entry door. Will walked in and I stood at the door, holding it open for the inmates to exit. Single file, guys, I yelled. I counted as they walked past me. As the last inmate walked by, I looked back at Will. That it? He gave me a thumbs up. Okay. I counted 20. 20. I said. I turned around and watched the inmates while I held the door waiting for Will. "You set a timer?" he asked. "Yes," I said, showing Will my watch. After a while, I looked down at my watch and saw there were 10 minutes left. I told Will, and he cupped his hands around his mouth. "All right, guys, 10-minute warning," he yelled. I scanned the yard and saw an inmate standing by the fence in the portion of the yard that bordered where I had heard the voice earlier. I began walking towards him, and as I got closer, I noticed he wasn't just looking at the scenery. "Hey," I yelled, "back away from the fence." He didn't react. I couldn't tell who he was with his back towards me. A few inmates in the area looked at me then, at the one I was yelling at. One of them, I recognized as inmate Zulu, tapped the inmate on the shoulder. "Hey bro, CO is trying to talk to you." I saw the inmate shake his head, like he was snapping out of being zoned out. "Huh? Oh, sorry," he said, turning around. I saw his face and recognized him as inmate Smith. "What's up, CO?" he asked. "You good?" I asked. "I was just telling you to back away from the fence." "Yeah, he stammered. "I'm good. Just kinda zoned out, you know?" He started walking back away from the fence. The look on his face was one of fear. "Something catch your eye?" I asked. He shifted on his feet for a moment. "No, I just zoned out." "Okay," I said, dropping the topic. I looked down at my watch and gave Will a nod. "Time's up, everyone in," he yelled. Once all inmates were accounted for and secured in their units, Will and I made our way to G-Pod, another general population unit similar to H-Pod, for the next yard rotation. While we walked, I couldn't keep my eyes from wandering to where inmate Smith was staring. "Something feels off," I said. "Try not to think about it until we are done with this," Will said. "Not saying you're wrong, I feel it too. Just don't think about it." When we got to G-Pod, we repeated the process. As the last inmate walked past, I called out, 1919. As Will followed me out, I reset the timer. We stood there watching the yard in silence. After a minute, a nervous-looking inmate I didn't recognize walked up to us. "Excuse me, COJ," he said. His voice was shaky. "Can I go back in? I don't feel safe out here." I eyed him curiously. "If one goes back, you all go back. Officer Will warned you guys of this before we came out here. He definitely did not look like the type to scare easily, let alone be threatened." "I know, but I keep getting this feeling that I'm being watched," he said. "Just have a seat over there," Will said, pointing to a wall a few feet from us. "We'll be right here. You don't have much longer left." He nodded and sat down where Will pointed. About 5 minutes later, the nervous inmate got up and started walking around. Not thinking about it, Will and I continued to stand there and watch. My watch started beeping. "Time's up, let's go," I yelled. I held the door open and counted as the inmates walked back in. 1818, I yelled to Will. After the words left my mouth, my face dropped. "We're down one." Will ran past me through the door. "Shit," he yelled. I followed, and we got into the yard. "What the fuck?" I said, looking up. Not 3 minutes earlier, it was sunny out, not a cloud in sight. Dark, dense clouds filled the sky, and the low rumble of thunder in the distance. We split up and searched the yard. It didn't take long to find the missing inmate. "Jay!" Will yelled. "I found him." I ran over to Will, who was already placing a tourniquet on the inmate's right arm. There were large, open slices going up and down each arm. Without hesitation, I put a tourniquet on his other arm. "What the fuck happened?" I asked. Immediately, I realized it was the same spot inmate Smith had zoned out. Will felt the inmate's neck for a pulse. "Nothing," he shook his head. I began to run for an AED and notified control that EMS was needed. When I got back, Will was already beginning compressions. "One more cycle, and it's your turn," he panted. I got the AED prepped and swapped with Will. "Cut his shirt," I said. Will grabbed his shears and cut open the inmate's shirt. We both jumped back when his chest was exposed. "How the fuck is that possible?" I yelled. There, on his chest, the words, "I tried. He died," were carved deeply into his skin. "That's fucked," Will said. I jumped back into compressions while Will attached the AED pads. We ran the cycle, each taking 3 turns. The AED didn't detect any rhythm, and when EMS got on scene, it didn't take them long to call it. Sergeant Wells got our statements before clearing us to go clean up. Standing there with EMS and Will seemed like an eternity. About 20 minutes later, Will and I were cleaning up in the locker room. "His back," I said. "You said there was blood on his back, right?" I asked Will. "Yeah," Will said, wiping blood off his arms. I grabbed a towel and wiped my own arms off. "If he was laying face down, with his arms underneath him, how would he have blood coming through the back of his shirt when you got there?" I asked. "You mean you think there's another message on the back?" Will said. "Exactly," I said. We walked out the locker room door and into a smaller room that held 4 desks with computers. When I started, it was referred to as the report room, a place for officers to come and write reports when there weren't any other computers available. I took a seat at one of the empty desks and began my report. After about an hour, I was done. "Will, are you done yet?" I asked. "Just about," he said. "Before I submit it, could you read it over?" "Yeah, only if you read mine," I said. He nodded and stood up, switching desks with me. After a few minutes, we were done. "Yours looks fine," Will said. "Yours too," I said, with a sly smirk growing on my face. "You fucking killed it, man. Great report." Will laughed. "Thanks, I was just dying to read yours." It didn't disappoint. We laughed for a few minutes. As dark as it was a nice reprieve from what we just went through. Just then, Sergeant Wells called us to his office. When we walked through the door, he was standing in front of his desk. "Gentlemen," he said with a nod, "how are you guys holding up?" Will and I looked at each other and back at Sergeant Wells. "All things considered," Will spoke. "Good. It was a bloodbath, but we are all cleaned up and reports written. "What's up, sir?" I asked. Sergeant Wells walked around his desk and sat down before motioning for us to do the same. "So, do either of you know just how it happened?" he asked. "To be completely honest, sir," I said, "no. I have no clue." "And you?" he said to Will. "One second he was sitting there next to us," Will said. "The next he got up and started walking. Nothing out of the ordinary, though." Sergeant Wells sat for a moment before turning his monitor towards us. "Watch," he said, before pressing play. On the screen, the footage replayed. The inmate was sitting next to me and Will before getting up and walking. He stopped right in the spot inmate Smith zoned out, and I noticed him displaying the same behavior. From where Will and I stood, he was in a blind spot, and when he got up to walk away, he disappeared into another group of inmates. Once everyone was inside, he just fell down. "Sir," Will said, "how did he get the cuts?" "Keep watching," he said. We watched in horror as he writhed on the ground. After a moment, he went limp. 30 or so seconds later, something rolled him onto his stomach. His arms moved underneath him. "Holy shit," I mumbled. "Here's where it gets weird," Sergeant Wells said, fast forwarding to Will and I arriving. As soon as I got back with the AED and took over, this dark shadow appeared, standing right on top of the inmate. Sergeant Wells rewound the footage and played it back, slower. I felt a knot form in my throat as I realized the shadow didn't just appear. It stood up. "Is that—" I began. "Yeah, it is," Sergeant said. His voice was solemn. We sat in silence. The footage paused on the image of the inmate's ghost. After a while, I said, "I never even knew his name." The seriousness setting in. I've talked with therapists, friends, families, and hell, even some clergy over the years. You can tell yourself it's a part of the job, make jokes, drink, or cope with other things. The fact of the matter is, no matter what you see doing this job, some things follow you home. I say that because working here, the only thing that follows you home are the thoughts, memories, the woman, and the battle scars. I hear stories of ghosts following paranormal investigators around or attaching to people at random. But here, there hasn't been any story of that happening. Something won't let them leave. "Sir, Jay has reason to believe there's another message, like the one on his chest, on his back," Will said. Sergeant Wells looked at us with intrigue. "Is that so?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "The footage cements my theory. See," Will said when he got to the inmate. There was blood coming through the back of his shirt, but that couldn't have been from his arms, because his arms were underneath him. Even in the footage, there was no point when he even reached for his back. "Go on," Sergeant Wells said. "On his chest there was a message." I tried. "He died." Something about that just seems, I paused, incomplete. I feel like there's more to it. Sergeant Wells looked back at the screen and pulled up some photos. We took the pictures when the coroner showed up. The first picture was of his wrists. They aren't clean cuts, Don't know what caused it, but we should have the autopsy results in a week or so. The second picture was of his chest and stomach. Here's the message you guys saw. Sergeant Wells looked at me. You were right in your assumption. He pulled up the last picture. J. Will. Feed. He paused, looking at me and Will. Anything you need to tell me? No, Will said. That's the message I heard come from the woods, I said. That's what worries me, he said. Hopefully he heard it too, and this is some kind of sick joke. Hopefully, Will asked, a tone of disbelief in his voice. Yes, hopefully, because the alternative is much, much worse, Sergeant Wells said. If this is an unnatural force as we suspect, this won't be the only body you'll see. Outside his office door, we could hear Graveyard coming into the briefing room. Sounds like it's almost time to go home, Will said. I hope you're right, Sergeant, I said. We all stood up, and Sergeant Wells walked us to the door. Let me know if you guys need anything. Thank you for the help today. As we walked into the hallway, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. Val rounded the corner and froze when she looked at us. What's wrong? I asked. Will and I walked up to Val. Her eyes never moved. They stayed fixed on where we were. What the fuck is that? She yelled, pointing behind us. I followed her shaking hand and saw this black mist forming right behind where me and Will were just standing. No, Will breathed out in a defeated tone. Before I could react, the realization hit me. There was a shadow in front of us, and Val had acknowledged it. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I turned my head to look back away before the shadow had fully manifested. I saw Val's eyes were still fixed on whatever was behind me. Her eyes were wide and tears were beginning to form. Her mouth hung open in shocked silence. Will, I pleaded, hoping he would have some solution. When I turned my gaze from Val to Will, he was standing there frozen, a look of anger on his face. He looked up in shock as the lights on the ceiling went off with a loud pop, one by one. Val looked at me, then at Will, the look of horror and fear replaced with a look of sadness and contempt. It'll be okay, she said, as the darkness enveloped the three of us. I felt a freezing, cold breeze on my skin, shortly followed by the sound of a pained scream. I closed my eyes and winced at the thought of what Val was enduring. It was quick. Almost as soon as the scream started, it stopped and was followed by a hollow thud, much like the sound of a sack of potatoes falling on the ground. Jay, you okay? Will's voice cut through the silence. When I opened my eyes, the lights were back on, and Will was standing next to me looking at the ground beside us. Yeah, I'm goo. I looked down and saw Val. She was laying on the ground. Her body was broken, but she was breathing. Shit! I yelled. Sergeant Wells rushed to us and dragged Will and I into the briefing room while the medical staff tended to Val. What happened? He asked. Will and I looked at each other and then back at Sergeant Wells. Almost at the same time we said, Rule 3. Sergeant Wells pinched the bridge of his nose. Fuck. Make sure you guys write a report on what happened and go home. I'll review the footage and see what it was." "You don't need to," Will said. "What do you mean?" Sergeant Wells asked. Will looked at Sergeant Wells. The anger returned to his face. It was the spirit of the inmate from earlier. "How do you know for certain?" I asked. "Well, 2 reasons," Will said, sitting down at a table behind him. "First, Val is still breathing, which means it's young and not as powerful as the others. Second, I caught a glimpse of it when I was turning around. It was the same face that stared back at me earlier. Only difference with this was that there was absolutely no life to his face at all. Something about what Will said made me feel ill. "I'll be right back," I said, running towards the locker room. Once I got inside, I splashed water on my face for a moment and felt the color return. When I walked back into the briefing room, I heard Will and Sergeant Wells talking. "You need to talk to him," Sergeant Wells said. "I know, but I don't need him getting." Will cut himself off when I walked in the room. "Jay, you feeling better?" "Tell who what?" I asked. Will hung his head and sighed. "You doing anything tonight?" he asked. "No," I said. "What do we need to talk about?" Will sighed. "Let's wrap it up here and we'll get a drink." "Okay," I said, still confused and slightly suspicious of what Will needed to talk to me about. As we finished our reports on what happened to Val and got ready to leave, Sergeant Wells's voice filled the room. "Fuck. Why?" I looked up from the computer as I logged off. "Whoa, what's wrong, Sergeant?" Sergeant Wells was standing in the doorway. He was out of breath. "The woman," he breathed. "She's... fuck." He bent forward, placing his hands on his knees, and took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay. I think I'm good now." He stood back up and looked at me and Will. I was watching the footage from the yard and I noticed something. "I thought we already watched all of it," Will said. "I backed the footage up to when the guy dropped, this time from a different camera." Sergeant Wells sat down and put a thumb drive into the computer. "Watch." He zoomed in on the inmate, and just on the other side of the fence, she was there. "Holy shit," I said. "Keep watching," Sergeant Wells said. As the footage played on, the woman stood there staring at the inmate. Her mouth was moving and she held a hand up towards him. Right when he fell to the ground, she looked up at the camera, winked, and vanished. Another message. Sergeant Wells sighed. "Well, we knew that," Will said. "This is different, though," I said. Ryan broke a rule. The consequence was him vanishing. Him being a message was more of a convenience. This was deliberate. They went out of their way to send this message to us. "What do you mean Ryan was the message?" Will asked. "Will, I know I said that I'd stop asking," I said, internally bracing for the usual frustrated answer. "What do you remember from the incident?" Will sighed. "Everything." I felt my heart rate rise. I expected the usual answer. "Nothing now. Please stop asking." But this caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" A hint of surprised anger in my voice. Will looked up, A look of frustration washed over him. I remember it all, Jay. He sat down and let out a nervous chuckle. The frustration left his face and was replaced with the look of relief. I watched as his body physically reacted to him unloading the metaphorical burden. After a moment, he looked back at me. Jay, I am so sorry. I know I told you I didn't remember. Why? I asked, still in shock. Why hide it? A look of shame and embarrassment now took hold of Will's face. I didn't want you to have to relive that night. A lot of shit happened, and I know you don't remember it. Jay, I didn't, I cut in. Will cocked his head slightly to the side. What? I didn't remember, I said. That's how I know Ryan was the message. I pulled out my phone. I went through a lot of shit, but I remember what happened. I flipped through my gallery and played the video Mary took of my meditation session. Holy shit, Will said after the video had finished. That was just one of the things I tried, I explained. But it wasn't the thing that brought my memories back. What else did you try? Sergeant Wells asked. I did a few different things, but the one thing that actually worked was hypnotherapy, I said. After I told them the story of my hypnotherapy sessions, Sergeant Wells told us to go home for the day. Will and I stood up and walked with Sergeant Wells down the hallway. Wait a minute, Will said, stopping at a picture on the wall. What's up? I asked. Doesn't that building look familiar? Will asked, pointing at a picture. I looked closely at the picture and realized it was the hospital we visited Ryan in. Yeah, it does. It shouldn't, Sergeant Wells said. That was the old medical plaza. What do you mean? I asked. 20 years ago, they built a new hospital down the road. It replaced the medical plaza, Sergeant Wells explained. When I was in high school, me and some friends went looking for that old building. We were going through an urban exploration phase. Only problem is when we got to where we thought it was, there was nothing there but a clearing in the forest. Maybe you guys went to the wrong spot, Will asked. That's what we thought, but when I asked my dad about it, he confirmed we went to the right spot, Sergeant Wells said. My mom used to work there and all our doctor's offices were there, so we knew where we were going. Did you ever go back? I asked. The next day, actually, he said. My mom thought we were full of shit, so she drove me there. We turned onto the road, and once we got close, the road ended. It was like the forest reclaimed the land. She insisted on getting out and walking. We got to the clearing, and the only sign of the building was the concrete corner for the base of the sign. I looked at the picture next to it. Hey, Will, doesn't this one look like that DHS building? Will looked at the picture. Holy shit, yeah, it does. There was this faint, familiar voice, seemingly coming from right next to us. Can I help you? When we looked around and saw nobody there. Can I help you? It repeated, trailing off like a memory. Will and I looked at each other. Was that? I asked. Yeah, it was, Will said. Hey, Sergeant, do you know anything about that building? Sergeant Wells shook his head. No, I don't know where that even is. Sergeant Wells, Please report to your office for an incoming call. A voice over the radio. Will and I stood there staring at the picture in silence while Sergeant Wells disappeared into his office. Will, Jay, get in here. Sergeant Wells's voice echoed through the hall. We walked into his office. He was sitting at his desk, his eyes fixed on the screen. What's going on, sir? I asked. What the fuck is that? He asked, pointing at the screen. I circled around him and froze when I saw the screen. It was Ryan. There's no way. He was on the outside of the perimeter fence, just staring at the camera. Will leaned in and looked at the screen for a moment before saying, "That's not Ryan." "Look closer." Sergeant Wells and I leaned forward. "Looks like Ryan to me," Sergeant Wells said. "He's right," I said. "That may look like Ryan, but really look at it." Sergeant Wells squinted and rewound the footage. He froze it on a clearer image of Ryan's face. His eyes widened and he immediately turned off the computer. "Time to leave," he said, quickly standing up. "Follow me." We walked behind him, trying to keep up with his pace. "Sergeant, what's happening?" I asked. "Not here," he said, slight panic in his voice. We followed him out and into the parking lot. "Get in," he said, opening the door to his car. Will and I got in. "Sir, where are we going?" Will asked. Sergeant Wells didn't answer. He drove us off the reservation and into the neighboring city. After pulling into an abandoned parking lot, Sergeant Wells got out. "Do you know what a skin wearer is?" he asked. "Why did we drive all the way out here?" I asked, stepping out of the car. "Do you know what it is?" he asked. "A skinwalker?" Will asked. "Worse, so much worse," Sergeant Wells said. "I had to take us off the reservation. If one is near and you speak about them, it acts as some kind of call and attracts more. The only way to make sure you aren't near one is to go as far away from the forest as possible." "So, what is it?" I asked. "Nobody knows what's underneath the skin they wear," he said. "Skinwalkers might mimic voices or take the shape of an animal or something familiar to lure their victim in. Skin wearers, however, wear the skin of their last victim and psychologically torture their target relentlessly. Once the target is broken and gives up, whatever is inside multiplies and takes over. The skin is the only thing remotely human about it." "Ryan isn't the first we've seen," Will said. "That voice in the hallway was the same as one we encountered in that DHS building." Sergeant Wells looked confused. "What voice?" he asked. "Right before you went to your office, there was a voice that said, 'Can I help you?' Did you not hear it?" I asked. "No, I didn't," Sergeant Wells said. "But tell me about the skin wearer you saw." "Do you remember it, Jay?" Will asked. I nodded. "He wore a suit. Only thing is that the suit looked to be more skin than clothes. There was no gap or give where you would normally see the clothes separate from the body. His fingers were too long and almost claw-like." I sighed. The face, however, was the creepiest part. The skin was stretched and looked like the sound of heavy steps slowly approached us. "Shh," Will said. As the steps got closer, It sounded more like someone with limp legs picking up and dropping their legs rather than natural walking. Jay, will, feed. The voice growled the words out. Just when whatever was walking towards us should have stepped into view, everything went silent, like something had sucked all the noise of the city up and swallowed it. Jay, will, feed, it said, quicker this time. There was a deep animalistic growl that echoed through the parking lot. I could feel the ground vibrate underneath me. We all piled back into the car. "Let's get the fuck out of here," I said. We drove back to the facility, all the while the feeling of being watched never leaving. As soon as we parked, Sergeant Wells' phone began to ring. "Hello?" he said. After listening to whoever was on the other end, Sergeant Wells looked at me and Will. "They found a body on the perimeter.